Well, welcome back to part two of this section on the Spanish colonialism, the Encomenderos. We're moving forward to the next section, which is the Evangelical Conquest, which is part two in this series. So we're just talking about the laws that were created, the new laws of Burgess in Spain to protect the indigenous people. And you say, well, why would the friars, right, the Dominican friars, why would they do all this advocating for the native people, in Hispaniola and throughout the Spanish Empire? And one thing to point out is just the solidarity of it. The point of departure which separated these voices of compassion from the rest of the church and from the society was their solidarity with the native population. This was a solidarity born out of direct experience and personal contact. So the friars were living among the indigenous people. They were working with the indigenous people. They were suffering with the indigenous people. And it was through this Simon of Cyrene moment, right? Helping Christ carry his cross. You experience that conversion moment yourself, right? There's this, through that Simon of Cyrene moment, the friars pick their sides, right? Who's being treated unjustly here, the Spaniards or the native people? Well, clearly the native people, right? The brutalization and the virtual enslavement of these people who were otherwise, on their own land doing their own thing. It was better for them had the Spaniards never arrived, right? And this is the painful element for the Dominican friars is, we're supposed to go out and spread the good news to the whole world, right? We're supposed to evangelize this idea that the peace of Christ is better than any peace that the world has to offer. But now you're seeing the reality of this colonialization. And this is not the peace of Christ of the scriptures. This is not the peace of Christ at the Mass. This is not why you became a priest, was to brutalize these poor innocent people. Right? This is the problem. But it's coming from living with them. Right? It's that solidarity of living with them that changes their hearts. What's pointed out is that there's a blindness to this suffering. Right? For the average Spanish person in Spain, they would be completely unaware of this, right? This is probably true of most of the colonization which took place, the European colonization, right? It points out many Spaniards, including the vast majority of the diocesan clergy, had very little idea of the suffering that the process of Christianizing the colonies was causing. All they could see were the cities and the churches being built, Indians being taught the Christian faith and learning European customs, and the vast wealth being accumulated. Right? You could probably get a sense of that, right? When the British Empire expanded, all of a sudden the average English person in the newspapers and things like that are seeing images of the Taj Mahal, of these palaces of the sultans and people, right? That you're seeing the lives of the wealthiest members of these foreign societies, maybe Indians, people from India in these British colonial outfits looking striking or something like this. And if you were to show any images of the poor, you would say, look at these poor people, right? They need our help, right? That justifies the mission in the colonization of India, right? it's a great nation. It's wonderful what we're doing, and look at these poor souls who we need to help. Right? This is the message, and the average person sees that and they believe it. Right? The same would be true with the Spanish Empire. Right? You see all the gold coming in from the New World. You think, boy, these people must be rich if they have this much gold. You see all these spices coming in and all this, these materials coming in, and you're hearing the stories from the perspectives of the Spaniards of how prosperous it is, how abundant the food is, how abundant the resources are, and maybe some little stories about the poverty and the savagery of the local people, but that you're making strides on Christianizing them. There's a certain amount of people who just hear that and they go, oh, that's wonderful, right? You want to believe that it's true. And a lot of people had no reason to believe it wasn't true, right? If you're not there. So there was just not to say that all the people there were innocent, but a lot of people are blind to the reality of things, right? Even most slavery that was done by the English, for example, the slave trade. There weren't many slaves in England. They were trading them in other parts of the world, so they never saw. The average person didn't see the slavery. It's easier to be in favor of it in principle than it is when you see the reality of it. Right, and this comes to this evangelical conquest that Friar Pedro de Cordoba envisions and he promotes, right? So Montesino is before the king made his claim. We have these new laws, and they have the ear of the king now. And I think it's important to know the dynamics of this politically in order to understand it better. So you have the friars on one side who represent the church. You have the Spaniards on the other side, the encomenderos, and then you have the crown or the king. And the friars are at odds with the Spaniards, and the king is a mediary as well. To look at it, let's look at the motivations, right? So the encomenderos, what do they want? Well, the native people, they just want them to do work for them, right? There's mines, there's fields, there's things that if they had more slaves, they could produce more gold and they could become wealthier, right? So it's in their self-interest to have as many enslaved people as possible, to give them as little as possible, and for them to work as hard as possible to produce the greatest amount of profit for them individually. This all leads to them having more power themselves, including more power than the crown, right? There is this idea, if you have this vast amount of wealth, a certain amount goes to the king in forms of taxes. You are becoming extraordinarily wealthy. If you and your compatriots are extraordinarily wealthy, you could buy armies, you can do all types of things. You could be more powerful than the king, right? And a lot of them would like to be, right? So there's that power for themselves, which is private profiteering, right? There's a profiteering in this. What's the incentives of the friars? Well, their ultimate goal would be to have true conversion, right? People saying, I want to become Christian, right? Not by the sword, but the true desire to be Christian and to live holy Christian lives, and for the spread of the church throughout the West, right? So as Martin Luther is destroying the church in Germany, soon you have Henry VIII destroying the Church of England. You have this new huge population of indigenous people who are potentially Catholic, and all of these future Catholic nations, which are larger than all of Europe, right, and more wealthy than all of Europe. There's potential, right? There's potential for the strengthening of the church and Christendom, and for there to be true conversion. They also don't want to upset the king, right? They need to be in the king's favor in order to be able to keep going. So it's to their advantage to work with the king the best that they can. Now, what does the king want? Now, the king has the most complicated situation because he needs to keep that type of aristocracy happy, and this is a very difficult balance. So if he does things that make the aristocracy poor, they could want his head on a platter and to replace him with a king who would be more favorable to their cause. However, if you make them too rich, too powerful, then they could try to replace you, right? So you need to keep them. They need to know that they are better off with you as king than somebody else, but they're not so well off as that they could challenge your power, that you could still strike them dead, through your wish, right? You could take away everything they have with the signing of your pen. You could take everything away from them. So they need to be favorable to you, but they also can't be too comfortable, right? Very difficult balance. All of this new gold coming in from the New World is upsetting the apple cart, right? In some ways it's great, right? All this wealth coming in, all this gold coming in. But what does it do to the gold you already have in your country? Well, it's inflation, right? It's a huge amount of inflation. If you say, well, no, I'm the richest man, I have 100 pounds of gold, and then all of a sudden 10,000 pounds of gold just comes in on the next ship, your 100 pounds of gold makes you poor, right? You're not rich anymore. Well, this is a little bit that can happen with the king, right? You have these encampaneros who have vast amounts of wealth now, and more wealth maybe than even the king, right? And that means they can challenge his power. It also means they could try to become kings themselves, right? They could be kings of much larger nations with much more land, with far more people, right? If you became the king of South America, you'd be massive compared to the king of Spain. You could even wage a war against the king of Spain and probably win, right? Very difficult. And the king also wants to keep the church on his side, right? He doesn't want to upset the Pope in particular, or deal with any type of issues there, as well as his own spiritual success, right? He doesn't want to go to hell, right? So this is a very difficult thing, and he also needs wealth to run the empire, right? He needs money too, right? Money needs to still come in, so it's a very difficult balance for the crown. Now, how does this come into play? It comes into play that really the king is better off supporting the friars than the encomenderos, because the friars don't want to replace him, right? The friars aren't trying to become king. Some of these other rich Spaniards are, right? They could be, right? They could have his head on a platter. That could be their end goal. The church isn't trying to get the money, other than the money that people give them. These people are, right? The Spaniards are. So you have one of these very famous encomenderos, Bartolome de las Casas, who owns, essentially owns native people. He has land, he has wealth, and over time he sees the evil of it himself, even though he was somewhat brutal at times, and even when he was a landlord. And hearing the preaching of Montesino, he converts, right? He was already a Catholic, but he converts in his heart that is right. This brutalization is anti-Christian and it's wrong. It's just a wrong thing to do. And he releases all of his encampaneros, right? He releases all the native people out of his service, and he goes back to Spain to plead on their behalf, right, for a more humane treatment. So 1514, he gives up his wealth. By 1523, he becomes a Dominican friar himself and a priest, and he's one of the most outspoken people against this system, although he is not the first and he is not the last. But he is perhaps one of the most vocal, and as a previous barbarian, as a layman, he has a lot of moral authority in this, because he says, I was in your shoes. I did this myself. I was brutal myself. This change of heart. And he's before the courts of Spain and the king, and he's promoting the Dominican approach, and they have this proposal, right? There's a proposal. And they propose an alternative approach, right? The Evangelical Conquest. So instead of a military conquest, let us turn the people into Christians and thus members of the empire, right? If they are all members of the empire peacefully, right, voluntarily, this is better than becoming members of the empire by force, which will eventually just kill them all, right? So what they suggested was, while retaining specific privileges of the monarchy, they would do away with the encomendidas, right? These trusteeships, and in general with a form of distribution of the natives, and with in turning them into members of the empire, right? And making them Spanish people, right? And by getting rid of these Spanish landlords and replacing them with the friars, this now becomes a mission land, right? Becomes mission territory and not the land of military exploitation, right? It's a very different approach, right? And who is the king going to side with, right? The military conquest of the New World or the mission approach to the New World? This is modern people have a very difficult time understanding these perspectives, right? Even when we deal with Native Americans in North America, Canada, the church is often seen as negative, but what people are missing is a big piece of this debate is over: are the indigenous people human beings or not, right? And if they're human beings, then they can become good Spaniards, right? If they are human beings, they can put aside the paganism of their culture, and they can become good Spaniards, right? Because they are equally human beings as Spanish people are. They just have a bad culture, right? That would be the perspective. They have a detrimental culture. If they can abandon the culture, you can turn them into a Spaniard, right? The term that we have for that is to kill the Indian and save the man, right? To turn that, if we can kill the Indian in him, right? The Indian in him, we can turn him into an American or a Canadian or something like that. This is seen as terrible today. But the alternative view was, these are not even human beings. Therefore, we can treat them as cattle or slaves. We can do whatever we want to them because they're not even human. So as bad as people might think that the approach of we need to eliminate the culture and retain the person, we might think of that as bad. It is still a million times better than the alternative, which is just to destroy them and to enslave them, right? There is a difference. One might be bad, but the other is far worse. And I think people have to be aware of that. So part of this proposal would say that the village chiefs would retain their authority under the king, right? So this is a big difference, right? They're not just conquered and then under the Spaniards as children. They're not children. They have some sense of self-autonomy. They get to retain their culture. They get to retain their land, their way of living. There's this goal to evangelize them, but it's not through force, but through volunteer, right? By presence and convincing them, right? To convince them to become Christian, but not by force. Another part of this would be that the mining would be replaced with agriculture and animals and the production of other things other than gold. Now, this also appeals to the king, right? So, what was made some of these Spaniards so rich was all of that mining, all of that gold, which a certain amount of gold is good. Too much gold, again, inflation, and if they have more gold than the king, then that's a problem, right? So, if they're sending in hides and food, this is good, right? The king needs this stuff to run the empire. It needs it needs to be productive, right? This isn't pure charity. You provide stuff for us, and we leave you alone, right? There's a certain amount. The friars were very practical, knowing that the king isn't going to say, "No, that's fine. You don't need to send us anything else." No, if they're going to be part of the empire, they need to supply the empire with something, right? Could be pineapples or something, right? But they need to send something, but it doesn't need to be the mining, right? This appeals to the king as well, right? So we have this new law, right? The law of Burgess that we talked about last time, which acts a little bit like a native Bill of Rights, 1512. In 1516, Charles V instructions to make effect that the captains of any expedition could not land in a new place and make war on native peoples or force them to work without the authorization of the missionaries assigned to the expedition, right? So this, then again, it takes the hands out of the warlords and puts it into the hands of the friars, right? So this is, again, moves in the right direction. Now, it seems like that should take care of a lot of this, right? This new vision, this new evangelization, right? We've completely refocused from the military approach to new evangelization. So everything should be solved, right? After mid-1500s, early 1500s, everything should go flowingly, right? But clearly not, right? There's shortcomings. And Lacassus reflects on this. He says, the defense of the indigents was a matter not only to be preached from the pulpit, but also to be defended in political planning and negotiation. This is a big part of this new evangelization, evangelical conquest, is that it's not just preaching it, it's political change too, right? Action. If they failed, it was not because they did not take political matters into account, but because they overestimated the power of the crown and to have the laws obeyed across the Atlantic. They got all of these rights from the king, but the problem is thousands of miles away over in the New World, if you're the guy with the guns in this small army, you can do whatever you want. By the time the king finds out, what are they going to do about it, right? Lacassus promoted this idea that the state needs to call into check the private entrepreneurship of these of the Spaniards, conquistadors. But ultimately, the king is somewhat he just depends on the subjects in the New World to do what he's asked. And if they don't, he doesn't have anything to enforce the mechanism to keep them from doing it, right? The king is balancing all these different interests within the empire, within Spain itself. Into the New World, he has even less control and even less ability to call people into check, which ends up being, the negative part about that is it ends up all falling on the heads of the indigenous people who get the brunt of it. So then if we want to look at this from the native perspective, the evangelical conquest, how would native people look at the evangelical conquest? This is hard because we don't have writings from the native people, right? We don't have those. This evangelical conquest could be from some point in the early 16th century, right? 1512. up until the present day, right? There's still indigenous people who are affected by policies, especially up to World War II, right? From 15 something to mid 19th century, mid 20th century, we have this colonization and decolonization going on, and it's from what we know from the 20th century colonization and our working with the indigenous people, we have very mixed reviews, right? There are very mixed reviews. If we look at the schools, right, the schools for the indigenous people, it's a mix, right? You have one side, you have the erasing of a culture, you have the erasing of a language, you also have the hardship of disease when people are living in close quarters. True of white people, true of indigenous people, true of everyone before the invention of penicillin, right? Life was hard. Most people died young, right? This is just the reality of the life before penicillin. Some people who are alive today have positive stories that they can tell about the indigenous schools, right? There was a coming together of young indigenous people. There was a sharing of community. There was a, different tribes came together, and there was a common, it was a coming together. Also, some of the skills that were learned, right? Very practical skills, education, very important, right? So there were some positive aspects of this, and there were also some very wonderful and saintly, loving people who were running these things and who were part of it. In contrast, there are also some very terrible people, abusive people who ran things like this as well. Right? So when we look at a history of 400 years of a policy like this, what were the evangelical missions like in North, South, Central, and the Caribbean for 400 years? We're going to have the whole spectrum, right? There's the whole spectrum that's there. We often hear about the worst. The church might proclaim the best. The truth is probably there's a lot in the middle, right? It's a lot in the middle. In comparison to the military conquest, the evangelical conquest is probably better, right? To say you keep your land, you keep your culture, you keep your language, you have your autonomy, and you're protected against these warlords by the church. And we're going to preach to you the good news and to live it out authentically in your midst to try to convince you to become a Catholic, right? Is better than the encampaderos. No question about that, right? I don't think we have any testimonies of good encampaderos in the New World, right? Even De las Casas, when he was an encampadero, was not good, right? Because if you're in that mindset of exploitation, profit, production, private interest, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. There's just a corruption that comes in with that way of thinking. The evangelical missions, right? The evangelical conquest had a different mindset about it, and I'm sure, even by their failures in various countries, right? The failures in Venezuela, if they didn't convince anyone to become Christian, that's what free will is, right? It'd be wonderful if you just went there and everyone just joined and it was a utopia, but that's not the reality, right? So they went there and they tried to without force to convert, and sometimes it was successful and sometimes it wasn't. It's also what happened when Christianity came to Europe. Sometimes people were successful and sometimes they weren't. We could ask St. Boniface that in Germany, right? not always successful every time. But I would think, from the native perspective, most would want to be left alone. Given that they would not be left alone, right? The modern world was knocking at their door. Of the approaches, the evangelical conquest would be the best approach in an imperfect situation. I would think is a fair enough answer. And I wish all of the members of the Evangelical Conquest were like St. Louis or De La Casse or Montesino or Cordoba. Unfortunately, they all weren't that way. Over a 400-year period of time, they all weren't like that. But they were. But I would think the average friar would be more like them than they would be than the encantaderos, right? Under the Spaniard conquistadors, right? Conquistadors only wanted gold. At least the friars had the souls of the indigenous people in their forefront. Okay, well, that's all I have for part 2, so I hope you found this helpful.